Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. Today, we have a real treat for me, and I think it's going to be for you as well, Professor Josiah Ober. He is a professor of political science and classics at Stanford University. I should disclose he was one of my professors, so it's really so exciting to be able to chat with him again about his new book. It was released just last week, The Civic Bargain: How Democracies Survive. In addition to his academic work on ancient political theory, institutions, and democracy, he's also the director of the Stanford Civics Initiative, a new program which is going to be teaching civics courses to Stanford undergraduates. So the link to that will be in the show notes as well. We talk about it a little bit at the end of the interview. But with no further ado, I hope you enjoy this discussion just as much as I did. Professor Ober, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Annika. It's just great to be here and really looking forward to talking with you.
So it's not that often that I get to talk to a classicist on the show. So I'm planning to spend as much time in the ancient world here as I feel like I can maybe get away with. But to kick us off here, let's look at kind of the broader picture. What's the point of writing a book like this? What's happening in America right now that leads you to believe that we need to look to the ancients?
My sense is, and certainly that's shared by my co-author, Brooke Manville, that there is a pervasive feeling in the country that something's really going wrong with our current democratic republic, that this is not the way it was meant to go, that there is much too much acrimony. Polarization has become increasingly problematic. And a lot of people, I think, feel that the end is near. We see a lot of books being written with titles like Does Democracy Die? Or When Does Democracy Die? So our goal was to, say, yes, it is a time of the real concern for the future of democracy. But if we're going to do something about it rather than write obituaries, what we ought to be asking is, how do democracies survive? And that took us back to the basics.
In your book, you list 3 instances of things that could be real challenges for democracies. Your 3 were growth in wealth, growth of citizens, and increased diversity. You said that they put a lot of strain on the ability of citizens to rule themselves. And I think as an American, you read that and you're like, oh, those are 3 things that we have a lot of. We're super rich, we're super diverse, and we have a hell of a lot of people, a lot more than we had at the beginning of the Republic. So looking at those 3 challenges, and in your book, you point out that other democracies in history have had similar challenges. What do you see as the way that we respond to those challenges?
So this is what we call in the book the challenge of scale, that in some ways democracies have to deal with their own success, at least historically. The ones that we're looking at, Athens, Rome, the UK, and the United States, are real success stories. In each case, the state got bigger, got richer, and got more diverse as it became more democratic. So that really is the big challenge, because democracy, as we understand it, is the self-government by citizens, that is, citizens governing themselves, rather than being governed by a boss, some third-party ruler. So the differences between citizens and the numbers of citizens who are engaged in this self-government tends to make it more challenging to build the kinds of policies, to make the kinds of bargains. We call the book the Civic Bargain for a reason. And it makes this kind of bargaining more difficult as you get more people, as it were, at the bargaining table, or more people responsible for electing representatives to bargain for them, when their interests are more different, and when there is increasing inequality among the resources that each of them command. So democracy requires some level of equality, political equality, between citizens, such that the idea of one person, one vote is not meaningless. And yet, as we gain in numbers, diversity, and inequality of resources, that question of how do a larger, more diverse body of people remain meaningfully enough equal such that they can really be imagined as governing themselves rather than being governed by some subset of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ancients in general will generously say we're pretty skeptical of this idea of one man, one vote. I mean, Polybius famously advocated for a mixed form of government. Today, if you said we'd like to incorporate more aristocracy and oligarchy into our democracy, I mean, oligarchy, people immediately think of like Russian oil tycoons, and aristocracy feels very contrary to our general sense as Americans. We don't like that word. So, you're writing this book about democracy. Why focus on democracy specifically?
Well, democracy we see as one of the real breakthroughs in human forms of organization. We look across human history, at least since the beginnings of large-scale societies, agriculture, writing, the apparatus that we think of as civilization. Most societies are run by bosses, either by a king or by, as it were, a gang, or a king supported by a gang, probably most frequently. The idea that the ordinary people, people who had to work for a living, people who don't trace their ancestry back to the gods, people who can't claim to have some special relationship with the divine order that isn't available, to most people. Just ordinary people could actually govern themselves is really a radical idea. It really changes everything. One of the things that it changes is the potential for very diverse forms of expertise and experience, and simply, life experience to be brought into the decision-making process. So instead of the decisions being made by people who have a very specific and very rare form of life, experience of life, understanding of what the world is. After all, kings, ruling oligarchs necessarily live in a bubble. They don't have access to the full range of human experience that exists within the communities that they govern. When we move to democracy, you have the potential for a great deal more, so many more inputs. So it suddenly breaks forward the potential for, genuinely innovative and free, open, and new ways of not only organizing ourselves, but new forms of technology and so on. So I think it's a hugely important development, and to my mind anyway, and certainly to the minds of people going back to antiquity, Aristotle, for example, being in a position of ruling and being ruled over in turns, that is, being a participant in the government of the community of which you are a part, is a fundamental human good, that there is something basic about being one of the rulers, among the rulers, instead of being permanently ruled over, that Aristotle believed, and I think he's right, makes a human life go better, all things considered.
I want to put a pin in Aristotle because there's a lot to unpack there. His views
Surely.
on democracy are complex.
That's right.
But you've kind of alluded to, I mean, in your answer, you were talking about the diversity within democracies being a really big innovation. But as I kind of alluded to earlier in the introduction to your book, you were saying that diversity is one of the big challenges that democracy or democratic government have to overcome. So I'm wondering, when we look at the ancient record, this is kind of a debate now that people are having about diversity versus unity. When we look at the ancient record, what does it have to say about that debate?
So I think that that really is the core of the challenge that democracies have to face is how do you make diversity into a net plus instead of a net cost. Now there always are costs. It's hard to organize a lot of people. It's hard to make decisions. Harder when people are more diverse in terms of their preferences, their interests, their experience of life. And yet, if you do it right, you get this advantage of bringing these diverse experiences, diverse forms of knowledge, of information, of simply raw data, get brought into the problem-solving space, and so it can be, a real advantage. How do you, get that to work? That's really the challenge, and it's a challenge ultimately of institutional design. How do you create the institutions that manage the problems that emerge from diversity and capture the value that comes from diversity? I think that really, for every successful democracy, has been the big question, and the really very successful ones answer that question effectively. It's not a once and for all answer. After all, you've got to continue to adapt your institutions as the world changes, as more citizens enter the, as it were, bargaining space. So it's a continued challenge, and clearly in the United States now, we're facing one of these moments in which we're asking ourselves, do we have the resources to answer the challenge? And that remains to be seen.
I mean, looking at the ancient world, are there examples of people or of civilizations, of city-states that are able to work well with diversity and harness the power that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think this really is certainly the case of Athens. It's the case of Rome, which starts out as really quite a small city-state. So if we look at Athens, the big breakthrough of the Athenian revolution that creates this democratic form of government in the late 6th century BCE brought into the role of being self-governing, a really large number of persons, many more than ever had been engaged in self-government before, probably in the range of 30,000, which was just sort of unthinkably big in city-state terms, and was very diverse by, once again, ancient city-state terms. So we tend to think of diversity in terms of racial or ethnic or religious backgrounds. But the Athenians thought of diversity in terms of what region of the Athenian territory were you from? Were you one of those guys who lived on the coast or near the urban center or in the agricultural inland? Very different lives, very different experiences, very different interests, or at least substantially different. Some people then very wealthy, some people having to lived very near poverty. Others in the middle, hardworking. Once again, the idea that people who are so different in terms of their wealth, in terms of their, as it were, regional identities, could all come together and govern themselves was really a huge challenge, understood as such. Aristotle writes in his account of the Constitution of Athens, or really the constitutional development history of Athens, that the guy who worked out the institutional frame that made all of this possible, Cleisthenes, deliberately sought to mix up the Athenians. He created new institutions that would require that men from the inland agricultural areas, the coastal areas, the urban areas would have to work together in relatively small teams in order to accomplish essential, as it were, government functions. And the idea was that they would then become citizens of Athens, that they would develop an identity, which was an overarching civic identity. It wouldn't replace their local neighborhood identity. They stayed, very attached to their villages or their neighborhoods. They certainly had different lives if they were wealthy or poor. But that was subsumed under an important civic identity as being an Athenian citizen. So there's an example of how it worked in antiquity, and it worked very well. The Athenians went on to great success. The same kind of thing we see in ancient Rome. The real distinction there between the plebeians, the ordinary Romans, and the Romans who could claim to be from a set of special families that had certain relationship to the divine order, the so-called patricians. The trick of creating a Roman Republic was welding together the plebeians and the patricians under a common, Roman citizenship, such that they could imagine themselves as Romans first, and then plebeians or patricians only second.
Yeah, I want to push you a little bit on the idea that both Rome and Athens were super successful at this. I think that is something that, people criticize Athens a lot for being unstable, that the democratic system fell apart relatively quickly. The Roman one, it lasted a long time, but I think if you look into the details of it, it is, full of really serious conflict and multiple, like a secessio plebis. We've had only one secession in American history, and it was one of arguably the greatest disaster ever to strike our republic. And so in the details, there's tons and tons of social strife and people having to strike multiple bargains and then those bargains falling apart. So defend for me a little bit why these two examples are ones that you consider really successful examples.
Yeah, so I think if we step back, we ask, what do we expect out of our society, or if we form a state, what do we expect out of the state in which we live? And I think in the first instance, we expect security.
Yep.
And then we expect the capacity to develop a certain baseline welfare. So a material standard that is well above, just bare life, and that really is that is a challenge in the Greek world, in the world that Rome emerged in. These are very fiercely competitive worlds, city-state against city-state, major empires at the periphery that were also predatory empires. So what we can say about ancient Athens and ancient Rome is they did indeed provide a successful, that is, relatively secure and relatively wealthy relatively materially successful lives for a great many people. Now, they didn't do this without conflict. Actually, obviously was, in fact, conflict. But if we look at the history of Athens, although Plato tended to see democracy as a constant churn and so on. There's sort of a background question that you can ask Plato. Well, gee, this democracy is so chaotic, it's so churning, it's so unstable. Why do you continue to live there, Plato? And gee, how come your teacher Socrates said that he actually preferred never to leave the city? And gee, you had this great student Aristotle. How come he lived almost his entire life in Athens? And I think the answer is, compared to the alternatives, this society, Athens, gave them both, once again, the capacity, the baseline security, the baseline welfare, the baseline protection, the freedom, the sense of being able to do what they desired to do, that was greater than any place else that they were going to be. It was a better place to be a philosopher, in part because it was more secure and more prosperous. So I think that that's something we need to look at. We can look at, do people want to join the club? Did people from around the Greek world come to Athens wanting to live there, even if they couldn't become full citizens? The answer is absolutely yes. Why did Aristotle come to Athens? Best place to be. Now, in his case, to become a philosopher. But why did thousands and thousands, almost certainly tens of thousands of other Greeks come to Athens? Because it was the best thing going. It was the most successful city-state around. And the same thing with Rome. Why do so many people convert, as it were, to being Romans? Now, sometimes in the aftermath of wars, but Roman citizenship expands dramatically across the period of the Republic. And that, I think, is, once again, some indication that Rome was a very successful state. Now, once again, compared to the alternatives that were available in antiquity.
All right, we have 3 strikes on Aristotle, so we got to talk about it. A lot of the basis for democratic thought, as the basis of many schools of thought within philosophy, a lot of it really is rooted in Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle, in fact, did not like democracy very much. I mean, you sort of alluded to Plato has all these complaints about it. It's not their ideal form of government. How do we square the circle? How much of the way that we think about democracy comes from Plato and Aristotle, and how much should?
No, very good. So let's start with Aristotle and work back to Plato,
Okay.
and maybe work back ultimately to Socrates. So for Aristotle, there were 6 forms of regime. 3 of them were imagined as ideal or best or uncorrupted. A pure form of kingship, a pure form of aristocracy, and a form of government that he called polity, sort of a pure form of democracy. The problem was that these were rare to non-existent, that he couldn't point to an actual kingship that fit his criteria. He doesn't seem to know of, at least in the real world. He might imagine he could create an ideal form of aristocracy. I think he imagines there are some of these better forms of polity, but that's really a cleaned up form of democracy. Most of the societies that he knew were either democracies, the other 3 forms of government that he identified, democracies, oligarchies, or tyrannies. These are all, of course, governments for city-states. His clear ranking among the commonly existing forms of government is that democracy is better than oligarchy, more stable, more able to suit what Aristotle imagined were the natural desires and capacities of human beings, and certainly better place for a philosopher to live. And oligarchy was much better than tyranny. Tyranny is just a disaster, according to both Aristotle and Plato. So, Aristotle, if you're going to say, well, you have to choose among the commonly existing forms of regime, that's very clear. He thinks democracy is the best form. We then go to Aristotle's ideal form of government that he lays out in his work called The Politics, in the last books of The Politics. And in some sense, it is certainly an aristocracy. All of the citizens of this ideal community that he'd like to imagine is a possible community. He calls it, the best possible form of government. All of the citizens are both virtuous and they're reasonably well off. They don't have to work for a living. But it's also the case that it's pretty clear that all of the adult male residents who are citizens of this of his ideal state are also serve as the rulers collectively. And so when all of the adult male citizens, all of the adult male residents who are native to the community are citizens in an active sense as being participants in the government, and that's Aristotle's definition of democracy. So he's got an aristocracy that's also a democracy. It may be imagined as a form of what he called polity. At any rate, there is something very strongly democratic about Aristotle's thought, in that he supposed that humans are political animals, and that as political animals, that is, individuals who have a strong impulse to engage in governing ourselves, any human who was not in some ways corrupted is going to have a desire to engage in government, and therefore the best form of government is going to make that possible. It's not going to be frustrating the natural desires, the natural capacities of most of the residents of the community. Oligarchy did frustrate those desires. So did tyranny. It's only when you have something that at least has these democratic features that you'd really have a form of government that is good as it could be. And I think so that's the sort of the democratic edge. Now, lots of things about existing democracies Aristotle didn't like, but still in all, he saw the existing democracies as better than most of the available alternatives.
So I want to push you a little bit on this idea that we sort of brought up at the beginning of this conversation, but the idea that democracy means having no boss. And I think the root of my question is, in what sense are the people not a boss? I think the ancients have this idea of demagoguery in which the people kind of take on that sort of more authoritarian role. Is that category still useful? Is the idea of people who appeal to the people as demagogues, is that somehow anti-democratic, or is it true that the people really can be a boss in the negative sense of the word?
Yeah. So the Greeks and certainly the Romans as well were very aware of the danger of what we now would call majoritarian tyranny. That the mass of people, the majority, would simply dominate in the negative sense, in the most negative sense, all others, and simply impose their will. It was especially concerning to wealthy elites who thought that the ordinary citizens, the people who had to work for a living, being the majority, would simply use their majoritarian power to basically exploit the wealthy, to extort from them their wealth. So that was a they were well aware of this as a real problem. We look at the history of the best documented of the Greek democracies, which is of course Athens. What we see is that doesn't happen. There's never a time in which the majority simply votes to take the wealth of the rich. What we get in Athens is, ultimately a civic bargain. That is a bargain among the people who were citizens, wealthy and non-wealthy, that ended in resisting the tendency of the wealthy or of the elite to become a boss, to create an oligarchy, to simply rule over in their own interest everybody else, but also pushed back against the tendency of the many to use their majority power to exploit the few. So it was a delicate balance. There was always the danger it could go completely off the rails. It had to be maintained through well-designed institutions, and it had to be maintained through constant communication. That is, the kind of speeches that political leaders, typically from the elite, gave in the public assemblies, such that the many, the people who came to the assembly, ended up voting for policies that were not exploitative, that did maintain security, that maintained welfare, that maintained the public peace, the peace in the community. And so once again, that's to tell that story in detail requires a lot of time and energy, and I've devoted much of my career to trying to tell that story. But it does get us exactly to this question of the demagogue, because the leaders in a democracy needs leaders. It's not going to work without anybody taking a position of leadership. The leaders in a democracy like that of Athens or that of Rome was in the form of those who could make successful rhetorical appeals to a large audience, to a council or to a senate or to an assembly of citizens. So rhetoric was really important. You had to be able to make an argument succinctly, powerfully, well put together, that will appeal to a large body, of a diverse body of citizens. So rhetoric then became a highly, absolutely essential tool. Developing, it becomes formally developed, and we get the great orators like Demosthenes or Cicero become, major political leaders. An orator, a great orator, can use that tool, that skill, for good or for ill within a democratic republic. Those who use it for good may take the title demagogue. It just means leader of the demos, right?
Yeah.
Leader of the people, and use it in the right way, as an advisor, as an expert who can give good advice, who can resist the tendency of a mass audience to simply grab at some short-term gain that's going to end up in long-term problems. And the other way, however, rhetoric can be used in a bad sense, and the demagogue can then either mislead the people, lead them to desire things that might seem to be great in the short run and are going to be catastrophic in the long run. There's certainly examples of that from ancient and modern democracy. Or the demagogue can turn out to be simply corrupt, can be doing things in his own interest or in the interest of a few of his friends instead of the common interest, and may lead to creating policies, getting votes that in the end only benefit a few instead of benefiting the public good. Or a demagogue can, in the worst condition, simply not be working for the interests of his community at all. He can be in the pay of somebody else. His voice can be bought. For example, as Demosthenes accused some of his rivals, they're bought by Philip of Macedon. And therefore, instead of being led in ways that will help the Athenians maintain their security and welfare, they're being led in a way that is to the advantage of some foreign power. But there's always that worry, right, that the leader of the people, the demagogue, will become one of these bad types as opposed to one of the good types. And the distinguishing between the bad types and the good types becomes one of the great challenges of every democratic community.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most famous example would be Julius Caesar. And I think it's such an interesting example to think about because when the most people's, popular perception of Rome, you think, okay, Caesar ended democracy. And then you think, okay, we have a Senate. Senate is democracy. As you point out in your book, actually, the Senate was a pretty aristocratic institution. I mean, you give an example where you're saying, in fact, one of the reasons why Rome was more democratic is because not everything had to be approved by the Senate, which is a really interesting turn of words. Talk a little bit about, I mean, in Rome specifically, that kind of appearance versus reality. I mean, what is the actual, is it actually true that the people as a whole tend to prefer to anoint a leader and the elites tend to be the ones who like to have big, long councils where you don't need to have a job and you can just show up and talk as long as you want?
Yeah, so this is really one of the big questions that I think it goes back to our friend Plato. I mean,
Yeah.
Plato was very worried that democracy would lead to tyranny because the people would come to follow a bad type leader who would, in the end, use his authority to take power, to become a boss, and therefore, by definition, to end democracy. If we say democracy is no boss except one another, as soon as the demagogue simply becomes the boss, then it's really all over. And Plato thought that was a likely outcome, or at least in principle, he thought it was a likely outcome. Not at all clear that he thought that was going to happen in his lifetime in Athens, which it did not. Then we go to Rome, and Rome has this once again set of really sophisticated institutions, including the institution of the dictatorship.
Yeah.
And so the Romans recognized that there were moments in which the crisis was sufficiently it's time sensitive, shall we say, that all of the ordinary sort of checks and balances that Polybius talks about in his great description of the Roman Constitution as being balanced between something like kingship and something like aristocracy and something like democracy, and that the consuls and the Senate and that the assemblies of the people balanced nicely and kept Rome on an even keel and allowed for growth without collapse. But there's always the danger that these institutions will get out of balance such that the dictator, someone given authority for a limited period of time to deal with a specific crisis, with that authority lapsing with the end of the crisis or within 6 months' time, whichever comes first, somebody's going to come up with the idea that, it would be nice to be dictator for the long run. Of course, that's ultimately what Julius Caesar does. He takes on this role and makes it without end, or at least until he is ended by various people who thought he had become simply a tyrant, the worst kind of a dictator. So this is always really a threat. I think that the idea that oligarchs, or perhaps it's better to say aristocrats, are willing to extend out to more democratic forms is true. The question is, do they do this out of some kind of a virtuous sense that would be the right thing to do, or do they do it because it's the best bargain that they can get? So if we think about, you talked about this secession of the plebs, the refusal of the plebs to go along until they got the right agreement from the patricians.
Yeah.
This is an example, I think, of the elite, the aristocrats, as it were, being put in a position that they have to give more. Rights, standing, influence to the rest of the citizens, that is, the plebeians. And that series of hard bargains, the plebs saying, nope, we won't fight unless, and the patricians finally saying, well, if you don't fight, then Rome is ended. And the plebeians saying, yeah, it's your choice, guys. And the patricians say, okay, all right, we'll share the consulship. Okay, intermarriage is all right. A series of agreements that are, they're hard bargained, but they are bargains, and they're bargains that brings Rome ultimately into this nice condition of balance for several hundred years that Polybius celebrates. But that balance has to be sustained. You've got to constantly adjust the balance as Rome got bigger and bigger, richer and richer. That's, again, this problem of scale. More Romans, more diversity, much more wealth, and being very unevenly distributed. Ultimately, the Romans weren't able to find that rebalancing, that recalibration. What happens? Well, eventually someone, turns out to be Caesar, says, you need a boss, I'll do it. And that basically crashes the whole Republican or Democratic approach.
Well, it's my least favorite part of the interview, the part where I have to leave the ancient world. So we're going to go back to talking about America here, but hopefully incorporate some of that, the ancient world, still back into it. You quote James Madison saying that America is a republic, not a democracy. And then later on in the chapter, you point out that neither Madison nor Rousseau knew enough about the real history of citizen self-government in ancient Greece to make the historical case for a distinction between democracy and republic. So we're a little biased. We're named after James Madison. What did James Madison get wrong?
Yeah, I think that Madison had a conception of democracy that really came from his reading of ancient Greek history.
Yeah.
And he read ancient Greek history based on the texts that were available to him. And the texts that were available to him were, for the most part, pretty hostile to democracy, for example, like Plato. He was really worried that Plato was right. If you get something that is democratic in an Athenian sense, things will fall apart very quickly. Madison was also worried that democracy had to mean all direct government by massive citizen assemblies. Rousseau has the same idea. We know much more now about the details of how the Athenian government actually worked. Madison didn't have the advantage of Aristotle's great work, The Constitution of the Athenians, which was only discovered on a papyrus 100 years after Madison was doing his work. Nor did he have access to the great large body of inscriptions that we now have, decrees of the Athenians, that actually gives us a much more detailed conception of how the Athenians did their business. So we really know more than Madison could have known. And one of the things that we learn from that is that Athens, in fact, had representative forms of institution. The Council of 500, which was one of the absolutely key democratic institutions, sets the agenda for the citizen assembly, was a representative body. It was chosen by assigning a certain number of representatives to each of the villages and neighborhoods of Athens based on population. So the idea that democracy is always direct is not right. The other thing that Madison really couldn't have known, because very little was known about the history of the post-Alexander period, the Hellenistic period, couldn't have known that democracy long outlived the takeover by the Macedonians. That democracy continued on for hundreds of years after sort of the golden age of Athens. So actually, it turns out that there was a much longer, much more sort of stable period of democratic development in the Greek world. Again, he just simply didn't have access to this. But Madison was one of the great, political theorists of all time, maybe the greatest political theorist that America has ever produced. But he's, like every other theorist, limited by the empirical evidence that he has to work with. Happily, we have empirical evidence for the history of Athens, the history of Rome, that Madison didn't have available to him. And therefore, we can say that the kind of sharp distinctions that he was making between republic and democracy simply don't hold in the cases that he was using to try to make that distinction.
Would it be fair to say that Madison was right by accident then, given what you said? Are there examples of things that he said that he thought conflicted with the Greek record, but that in fact went along with it?
So I think Madison, maybe the thing that Madison most wanted out of the Greek record, if I'm getting your question right here, is really an account of how does a federal state work. He had Polybius, who was an official in the federal state of Achaia, but Polybius doesn't really give enough evidence for that. He gives you a sense of, yes, this was a great thing. It worked out very well. It was a bunch of independent states that worked together to be a kind of super state. That was what Madison was aiming at. But once again, he just didn't have enough evidence to get it out of the ancient text. We now know much more about federal states than he did then. But he got it right? He figured out, how to, maybe by accident, but by taking what he did know and then just extrapolating what might be possible. He saw that it would be possible to, in fact, create a much larger state that would be stable and that would not be subject to what he thought was the necessary instability of very small republics. So yeah, in that case, he used what he got, what he had, and maybe accidentally, or maybe simply because he's just a great theorist, and he can extrapolate from first principles.
Yeah.
He envisioned what a federal state could be, and why expanding the size of the state would not necessarily cause it to fall apart. Why a republic, in his terms, could in fact be great instead of having to be small.
I want to talk a little bit about the word bargain here. Bargain is a kind of a selfish word. I mean, a bargain does not imply that you're thinking, oh, what can I do that can help my opponent? You're thinking of them as an opponent. You're trying to think of something that works. And in fact, the most impactful bargains that you talk about in your book and that we've talked about in this conversation are things like the American Revolution, which are caused by terrible governance, things like Magna Carta that are caused by terrible financial corruption. Is this a negative picture? Are we going to have to rely on people, different groups of people really just kind of jostling for themselves? Are we going to have to experience another cataclysm in order to pursue the civic bargain?
No, great question. So a bargain, as we understand it, is not zero sum. If we say that everything that you gain, I lose in some kind of a deal that we're making, it's not a true bargain. Some people have called that the gunman's bargain. Your money or your life. The gunman, gets your money, and well, you get away with your life, but it's not a true bargain. In true bargains, both sides are better off inside the bargain than they are outside the bargain. So you think every time you go into a store and you give the guy some money and the guy gives you a widget. You're better off with the widget. The store owner's better off with the money. You agree that that's the case. Now, maybe if you were to get everything you'd want, you'd get your widget and not give any money for it at all. And maybe the store owner would get your money, and not give you the widget. But that's would not be a bargain. You both recognize that the other side is gaining something. You're not gaining everything that you might ideally hope for, but you're much better off, or you're relatively better off inside the bargain than you are outside of it. And this means that real bargaining, you're not thinking of the person with whom you're bargaining as your enemy. You can say it is your bargaining partner. You can say it is, an opponent in that. You're trying to get as much as you can. You'd like to offer the least money possible for the thing you're getting. Maybe you're negotiating over a used car or something that you think there's some real wiggle room. But nonetheless, it's not your enemy. And that's why we say in the book that in order to maintain the kind of civic bargain, that is the kind of bargain about how are we going to live together? What are the procedures we'll use to make decisions? What are the actual decisions, substantive decisions that we'll make? This has to be made by people who imagine themselves as what Aristotle called, our friend Aristotle again, what Aristotle called civic friends. Now, my civic friends aren't my personal friends. They're not necessarily people I want to even hang out with a lot. I might not even like them, but still in all, they are people with whom I am in a shared project, and a shared project or a shared enterprise that is ongoing. And I recognize that I need to treat them as bargaining partners, not enemies, individuals with whom I'm going to try to create more value in total rather than destroying them. And that's really the key thing. I think that's really one of the dangers that we confront now in the 21st century is the rather high level, or relatively high level of enmity, the tendency to see those who don't agree with us in the other party as being our enemies, people who should be destroyed, who must be somehow thrust out of the common enterprise in order for the enterprise to go forward. And that's fatal. Without the capacity to bargain, without the capacity to see those with whom we're bargaining as civic friends, democracy, democratic republics can't exist.
So in your book, in the introduction, you list 7 things that we're going to need if we're going to maintain democracy. Civic friendship is one of them. Another of them is civic education.
Yes.
And I know that, just sort of by virtue of having been your student and being involved at Stanford, I know that you've done a lot more for this than many people, and which is no mean feat, because I think right now, more than ever, everyone likes the idea of civic education, but the issues that are most important within civic education are some of the most contested, and people really have deep disagreements about how you should teach really basic things like American history, and all those kinds of topics. So coming a little bit from your personal experience, talk about what a positive vision for what civic education should look like.
Yeah, thanks. We do say in the book that this is really the ultimate foundation of all the rest of it. If we have the right kind of education as citizens, if we learn the right things, and if we teach one another the right things, then we will recognize the essential nature of civic friendship. We'll be able to make bargains. We'll be able to create the right kind of institutions, make decisions about who is a citizen, maintain security and welfare, and continue to govern ourselves without a boss. So both all the way up these 7 conditions. It all really rests on civic education. So today, what do we need? One place to imagine starting is it would be great if all Americans could pass a naturalization exam.
Yeah.
That would be a good foundation. I don't think that's an adequate foundation. I think it's really important to know that there are 100 members of the Senate. The Electoral College works like this, and so on. But I think we have to go deeper, at least at the level of higher education. We have to go substantially deeper than that. And we have to, I think, recognize at the core the essential value of cooperation. I think that's what civic friendship or civic education really needs to be about, is about why is cooperation important? It's easy to forget. We can imagine ourselves as being in a kind of dog-eat-dog competition all the way down world. We're not in that world. We're in a world in which we have to cooperate. And we have to recognize then, why is cooperation hard? What's so difficult about cooperation? And that really gets into questions that are addressed, for example, by contemporary game theory. So I think that needs to be part of why do we need cooperation? Why is it hard? Is it hard because people are mean? No, it's because of our self-interest. People have some grounding in self-interest, and in order to cooperate, we have to find ways that we can conjoin our interests. We don't fall into these dilemmas of cooperation. So I think we certainly need that. We need to understand our own history, American history, but we need to go beyond American history. I think the tendency to think, that's all there is to civic education, is learning what happened in America, is a mistake. Well, you and I can probably agree, but I think we can make the argument that if we don't understand the deep history of democratic republics, if we don't understand what's happened, for example, in early modern cases in which democracy failed miserably. We look at the French Revolution and what happens there. We need to really then sort of expand out, understand what are the conditions that make democracy work, and under what conditions does democracy fail. We need to get people to think about the relationship between conditions, the things that we need to make this thing work, and our values, right? We tend to sort of think that conditions and values are the same thing, and clearly they're related, but they're not just the same thing. At any rate, we need to think about how values like freedom, equality, dignity of persons relates to the basic conditions, capacity to bargain, being civic friends, and so on. And once again, that's not simple. It's not even simple to think about how freedom and equality are balanced out among between themselves as values. So we need to think about how to balance the power of a community of citizens to do things through ultimately majoritarian forms of decision making is balanced out against the rule of law. That's not an easy one.
Yeah.
Getting it right is really important. If we can't make changes, we are going to atrophy. If we have no kind of steering, we have no kind of brake on the changes we make, we have no respect for law, we're going to go off the rails. So I think that needs to be right there. And ultimately, we need to think about the essential role of sharp criticism of our democratic system and of the values that sustain it. So we need people like Plato in order for democracy to work. I think the core idea is that Athenian democracy would not have sustained itself for as long as it did if it hadn't had serious critics challenging the Athenians to do better, challenging them to incorporate the rule of law into the kind of majoritarian institutions that democracy began with. We need then to attend to criticism, philosophical criticism, protest, and listen to criticism when our practice and values become a disjoint. So, ultimately, I think civic education needs to tell us, teach us, remind us that democracy is really hard. It's hard to get, it's hard to keep, but it also needs to explain, once again, generation by generation, why it matters. Why is it better to live as a citizen in a republic than it is as the subject of even a benevolent sort of dictator? And I think that's, once again, something that needs to be thought through. It needs to be taught. At least we need to present people with that argument and let them decide for themselves whether it's better to live with all of the struggles and difficulties we have being free, or whether it would be better to live contentedly with maybe a rather gentle boot on our neck.
Well, I'm so sad to have to cut this conversation short, but I can't think of a better note to end on, and we are at time. So thank you so much for the work that you've done at Stanford implementing that civic education, and for this book. It was really, really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Attica. I'll look forward to next time we talk.
Well, there you have it, Madisonians. Professor Josiah Ober on his recent book, The Civic Bargain, How Democracies Survive. The link to the book is in the show notes. As I remarked to him before this interview, one of the really great things, in my opinion, about the book is that rather than making sort of broad statements about democracy, it really goes in depth on historical examples of democracies and the civic bargains that sustained them. So please do go ahead and check it out. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find out more about us at the Madison program and what we do here on Princeton's campus at jmp.princeton.edu. In addition to the full archive of Madison's Notes episodes, you can also find all of our upcoming events for this year. All of our past events you can get on our mailing list. You can also get immediate updates about what's going on here at the Madison Program by following us on Twitter @Madison Program or on Instagram or Facebook. And, as always, we really appreciate any ratings or reviews. Let us know how we're doing. It's really helpful for us to hear from you. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time here on Madison's Notes.